They used to say no one in the family remembered him, but that wasn't true. They just remembered the version they were told to forget. Mark knew this because he was that version. The one born from a story no one wanted to retell, a name never spoken, a mistake hidden so well that even the silence started to believe it was doing the right thing. He wasn't looking to be remembered when he walked up the porch steps of the small craftsman home in southeast Portland. He was there to do a job, another house, another patient, another name on a chart. But when the door opened and the woman on the other side looked up with gray-blue eyes and a cane trembling in one hand, something inside him locked into place like it had always been waiting. She didn't recognize him, but he'd recognize her anywhere, even if he had only ever seen her face in a fading photograph tucked behind his foster dad's Bible. Mark was 34, not old by anyone's measure, but life had wrung the softness from his bones early. Growing up in group homes and bouncing between cold, overcrowded apartments left little space for innocence. He came out at 19 quietly, without drama, because he never expected anyone to clap. What mattered wasn't how others received it. It was that, for the first time, he'd said it out loud and the sky didn't fall. He never blamed his mother. Marianne had loved him fiercely, but from a distance. She died young, cancer, fast and mean. In her final week, she told him, "You don't owe them anything." She meant the family, the one that never claimed either of them. But Mark still carried the shape of them like a phantom limb. Elaine Turner, 76, was his new client. Widow, retired teacher, 2 strokes in the last year. Her daughter had signed her up for part-time home care and promptly left town for a business trip that seemed to keep extending. Mark knew the type, women who appeared at hospital bedsides with designer handbags and disappeared the moment there was no one to impress. Elaine's house smelled like old citrus wood and unopened books. It was clean, too clean, like no one had touched the furniture in months. She had one of those sharp voices that made everything sound like an exam question. "You're the new one?" she asked, and he only smiled. "Mark, ma'am, just Mark." He didn't tell her who he was. He didn't see the point, not then. Instead, he unpacked his supplies, folded her blankets just so, learned how she liked her tea, and when her knees hurt the most. He started showing up early and staying a little later. Not because it was required, but because something about her silences reminded him of his own. Every night when he locked up the medication bottle and dimmed the lights, he'd catch her looking at him. Not quite with suspicion, not yet with trust, but with that quiet, searching gaze of someone trying to place a face they should have remembered. She didn't like that he was gentle. Once, he brought her a lavender-scented balm for her hands, and she raised an eyebrow. "That's flowery." "So am I," he replied with a small shrug. She didn't laugh, but she didn't frown either. Just looked out the window for a long time, like maybe the words had stirred something buried. The neighborhood was quiet, all rusted mailboxes and wind chimes, the kind of place that still pretended it hadn't changed since the 90s. Mark fit in the way a dandelion fits between sidewalk cracks, present but not necessarily welcomed. A couple of neighbors waved, one didn't. He'd been through enough houses to know when he was being watched through half-drawn curtains. None of it surprised him. He wasn't here to be liked. He was here because he knew how to stay when others left. At night, he sat on the back steps with a thermos of cheap black coffee, watching the sun slip behind the cedar trees. Elaine rarely came out, but once she asked him why he stayed in this line of work. "Because when people are sick," he said quietly, "they stop pretending, and I'd rather live in truth, even if it's hard." She didn't respond. But the next morning, he found an old book of poetry on the kitchen table with a bookmark wedged in a page that read, "Even the child never held still learns to cradle others." Mark ran his fingers over the paper. He didn't say thank you. He just made her tea the way she liked and placed a tiny pride pin by the sugar bowl. Not to prove a point, just to let it be seen. If this story speaks to something inside you, a truth, a wound, a memory, don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories. Because sometimes the ones the world forgets are the ones who carry the deepest truths. Elaine had never been good with silence. Not the kind that lingered between heartbeats or filled the space between words, but the kind that felt like waiting. And since Mark arrived, her house had become quieter in a way that was unnerving. Not cold, not heavy, just still. She had grown used to the clatter of her daughter Karen's rushed footsteps, the ping of texts unanswered, the click of heels exiting before questions were asked. But now there was a man with soft steps and steady hands, a stranger, yes, but one who folded the dish towels like her late husband once did, and who made soup that didn't taste like obligation. She didn't ask many questions. She watched instead. And Mark never overstepped. He didn't fill the room with stories about himself or ask too much of her. He simply arrived, observed, and responded in the kind of way that made you feel like someone remembered what you needed before you said it out loud. She noticed he always wore neutral colors, but kept a small rainbow pin on his keys, never tucked away. She didn't comment on it. She was too old to be surprised, too tired to be judgmental. But it settled in her mind like a small stone in a shallow pond. The world had changed, and she knew she hadn't always changed with it. There were things she'd said decades ago, things she wished she could unsay. But regrets weren't currency. They didn't buy you peace. They just sat there, collecting dust. One morning, Mark arrived early, arms full of groceries. Elaine had forgotten they were out of milk, but there it was in his hand, along with a carton of blueberries she hadn't mentioned in weeks. "They're your favorite," he said simply. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing. That afternoon, she allowed him to push her wheelchair to the park 3 blocks down. It was the first time in months she'd left the house for something other than a medical appointment. They sat near the duck pond, and Mark quietly peeled an orange for her handing over the slices one by one. She didn't ask why he remembered she had trouble with the peels. She just took them. They didn't talk about anything meaningful, not yet, but there was something sacred about the ordinary. A man and a woman on a park bench, not family, not quite friends, just 2 people watching the wind toy with maple leaves. On the way home, she asked him where he was from. "All over," he said with a smirk, "but I was born nearby. My mother used to live just a few blocks from here until the family didn't want her anymore." Elaine blinked. "What was her name?" "Marianne," he replied with a softness that sounded like memory wrapped in gauze. Elaine said nothing. She didn't need to. The name hit her like a whisper across glass. Fragile, familiar, full of what-ifs. But she wasn't sure yet. Couldn't be sure. Marianne had disappeared decades ago, gone in a storm of slammed doors and shouted ultimatums. The last thing Elaine ever said to her was, "If you keep that baby, don't ever come back." She thought that sentence had buried itself, but now it stirred. Days passed. Mark rearranged her pill trays, read aloud when her hands ached, clipped her roses with quiet reverence. She started to ask about his life, not because she was curious, but because she wanted to understand why he was still here. "You live alone?" she asked one evening. He nodded. "By choice?" He paused. "By peace." She didn't know what that meant, but it sounded like something earned. Karen stopped by on a Sunday. She brought store-bought muffins and stayed exactly 12 minutes. Elaine noticed she didn't ask how she was feeling. Didn't notice the new bruise on her arm or the way Mark had placed a heating pad behind her back. Karen just talked about school schedules and work deadlines and asked if Mark was keeping everything under control. It wasn't a question. It was a warning. After she left, Elaine stared out the window for a long time. "She always leaves with her heels too loud," she muttered. Mark didn't answer. He just covered her with a blanket that smelled faintly of chamomile and rain. That night, Elaine couldn't sleep. Her chest felt too tight, not from illness, but from something older. A weight that settled behind her ribs every time she thought about the daughter she drove away, the grandson she never knew. The silence that grew so wide between them all, it turned into a canyon. She shuffled to the hallway and stood outside the guest room. The light was off, but she could hear the rustle of sheets, the turning of a book. She didn't knock, didn't say anything. Just placed a photo, worn at the edges, sun-faded, on the console table outside the door. It was of Marianne, 17, in a sundress, smiling like she still believed the world would hold her. The next morning, the photo was gone. Neither of them mentioned it, but Mark stayed a little longer that day, and when he refilled her water glass at lunch, his hands didn't shake and hers didn't pull away. Elaine had always believed that the past stayed buried if you didn't dig. But there was something about Mark, the way he folded towels like someone who once ran a home with too many people and not enough love. The way he spoke to her with that careful mixture of duty and gentleness. Never once transactional. That made old memories start to ache like old injuries in the rain. She didn't ask for a DNA test. She didn't need one. The shape of his jaw, the way he looked sideways when thinking, the silence he wore like armor. He didn't need to tell her. Elaine already knew. This man who cooked her breakfast, who put eucalyptus oil in her humidifier when she forgot to breathe right, this man was her grandson. She didn't say it out loud, not yet. There was a strange comfort in the almost, in knowing but not naming, because once she named it, she would have to account for everything she'd failed to be. She wasn't sure she was ready for that. Karen, however, had no such hesitations. She'd always carried herself like someone who knew where everything belonged. The linen napkins, the good china, the hierarchy of attention in a family too practiced at pretending. When she showed up again midweek with a bag of overpriced groceries and a face scrubbed clean of warmth, the air shifted. She glanced at Mark like he was a wrinkle in her schedule. "You're still here?" she asked, not even bothering to hide the annoyance. "He's helping me manage the schedule," Elaine replied, sharper than usual. Karen frowned. "Don't we already pay for that through the agency?" "He's not from the agency anymore," Elaine said, cutting a slice of pear with a surgeon's precision. "He comes because he wants to." That night, Mark found a drawer slightly ajar in the guest room. Inside, old photographs, curled at the edges, paper brittle with time. In one of them, a young woman stood on the porch of a faded house holding a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. No caption, but he knew it in the way you know your own shadow. He closed the drawer gently and didn't mention it. But when he made tea for Elaine the next morning, he left a small daisy in the sugar bowl. It was the same flower his mother used to braid into his hair when he was 5. She'd called them the kind ones. They bloom for everyone. The tension escalated quietly. Karen began texting more often, asking pointed questions. How long was Mark staying? Was he being paid? Was he bringing friends over? The implications stung more than the words themselves. Mark never responded. He let Elaine handle it, which she did with increasing frost in her tone. One day, Karen asked point blank, "Why are you so protective of him?" Elaine looked her daughter square in the eyes and replied, "Because he's the only one who listens." But Karen wasn't done. She started dropping by unannounced, peeking through the fridge, counting medication bottles, asking the grandkids what Mark did during the day. One evening, while Mark was watering the plants outside, he overheard her whispering into her phone, "He's wormed his way in. I think he's after something." That night, Elaine didn't eat. She sat curled in her recliner, blanket pulled up to her chin, hands clenched like fists beneath the folds. "Am I making a mistake?" she asked softly. Mark didn't answer. Instead, he moved her tray closer and said, "It's okay to be afraid. It just means you're trying." Later that week, Elaine asked him to walk her to the mailbox. It was a short stroll, barely half a block, but she insisted. Mark steadied her elbow, felt the tremble in her bones, the hesitation in her breath. At the mailbox, she handed him a sealed envelope. "For the lawyer," she said, "can you drop it off tomorrow?" Mark nodded without asking. He didn't need to know what was inside to feel its weight. The next day, Karen arrived early. Elaine was in the back room napping. Mark answered the door, expecting a quick visit. Instead, Karen pushed past him without a word, heading straight to the kitchen. She opened drawers, checked cabinets. "What are you doing?" he asked, voice calm. "Looking for proof," she snapped. "Of what?" "Of whatever it is you're trying to take." Mark didn't move. "There's nothing here you want," he said softly. Karen spun around. "You don't get to say that. You're not family." The silence between them cracked. Mark didn't flinch. "That's funny," he said, "because I'm the one who stayed." Elaine from the hallway had heard every word. She didn't speak until Karen left in a flurry of heels and rage. Then slowly she shuffled into the kitchen and reached for Mark's hand. Her fingers were cold. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "not just for today, for all the years before this. I knew who you were the second week you were here. I just couldn't bring myself to admit it. Not until I saw how much you gave and how little I ever did." Mark squeezed her hand gently. "It's not too late to see someone," he said, "even if you couldn't raise me." That night, Elaine took the photo of Marianne off the hallway wall. She dusted the frame, polished the glass, and set it in the living room, right next to a new photo, one she insisted they take together on the porch. Just the two of them. No explanation needed, just presence. And somewhere between the old regrets and the new arrangements, something shifted. The house felt less like a place she would leave and more like a space she could finally call home, because someone in it finally stayed. The envelope Mark dropped off at the lawyer's office contained more than just words about. It carried decades of silence finally broken. Elaine had made her decision. The house, the savings, what little inheritance she had, none of it would go to Karen. It would be split between her grandchildren for their future education, and the rest would go to Mark, whom she named not as caregiver, not as friend, but as family by presence. When her lawyer raised an eyebrow at the clause, Elaine simply replied, "He's the only one who ever sat with me without looking at a clock." It was her truth, and she signed it with a pen that trembled only slightly in her hand. But truth doesn't stay quiet for long, especially in families built on illusion. Karen must have felt the shift even before she had proof. Her calls turned sharp, her visits less about check-ins and more about checking up. She grilled the grandchildren with questions that sounded sweet but stung like nettles. Did Mark say anything strange today? Has Nana been acting confused? Has he bought anything expensive? She wasn't worried, she was positioning, preparing, looking for angles in a house that no longer revolved around her. The first official blow came by certified mail. Mark opened the envelope. His name was on the label, but the words weren't for him. They were for Elaine, but designed to hit him. A petition from Karen requesting a medical evaluation of Elaine's mental capacity. The implication was clear, that Elaine was being manipulated, that the Mark she had welcomed into her home was a parasite in disguise. He didn't tell Elaine right away. Not because he feared her reaction, but because he wasn't sure she had any strength left to carry more disappointment. But she found out anyway. Karen never did anything quietly. One morning, Mark returned from the pharmacy to find Elaine sitting upright in the living room, an unopened letter in her lap, her eyes distant but dry. "She wants to prove I'm broken," she said flatly. Mark knelt beside her. "You're not." Elaine looked at him then, repeatedly looked. "I was, but then you walked in with that awful cardigan and cheap coffee and made me feel like I mattered again. That fixed more than any pill ever could." Mark wanted to smile, but the grief was too close to the surface. Things got worse from there. Neighbors who once waved at Mark now avoided eye contact. At the grocery store, he overheard his name, whispered between tight-lipped glances. "That's him," someone muttered near the canned soups, "the one living off that old woman." Even the pharmacist, usually chipper, hesitated when handing over Elaine's meds. "Everything okay at home?" she asked, not innocently. Mark nodded. "It's calmer than most houses I've been in." He left without saying more, but the sharpest blade didn't come from adults. It came from the children. The grandkids, sweet, bright-eyed, curious, began pulling away. Not overtly, not cruelly, but with the subtle distance that comes when someone you trust plants doubt in your mind. They stopped asking Mark to help with homework, stopped leaving their drawings on the fridge for him to find. One afternoon, the oldest, 12 and trying too hard to act like it, sat beside Mark on the porch and mumbled, "Mom said you're not really part of our family." Mark didn't flinch. "Do you believe that?" The boy shrugged. "I don't know, I just know things feel different now." Mark didn't respond. He just handed the boy a glass of lemonade and sat beside him in silence, letting the ache bloom quietly in his chest. Elaine noticed. Of course she did. She tried to call the Karen, but the calls went unanswered. Tried to reach the grandkids, but got only brief texts and polite excuses. It wasn't just separation, it was strategy. Karen was drawing a line, one that Mark had no say in. Late one night, Mark found Elaine in the laundry room, her thin hands shaking as she folded towels that didn't need folding. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't look up. "She's poisoning everything I still love," her voice cracked. "Even them. The kids. They used to run to me. Now they come because it's scheduled." Mark stepped forward. "They'll come back." Elaine finally looked at him. "But what if I'm not here when they do?" He didn't have an answer. A few days later, Mark stood in the kitchen when the door slammed open. Karen's voice sliced through the house before she appeared. Where is she? She demanded. Mark stepped forward, protective instinct rising like heat. She's resting. She'll want to be awake for this, Karen snapped. I want answers. Elaine entered moments later, pale but composed, dressed with quiet dignity in a shawl Mark had knit for her after her second fall. If you have something to say, she said to her daughter, say it without yelling. Karen held up a printed email, something from the lawyer's office, a confirmation receipt. You changed everything, she hissed. You left me with nothing. Elaine didn't flinch. I left you with the consequences of distance. Karen turned to Mark, eyes blazing. You think this is love? You think because you're, what, loyal? You deserve what was never yours? Mark stood still. I never asked for anything. I stayed because no one else did. Karen scoffed. You stayed because no one else wanted you. That one landed, but not the way she hoped. Elaine took a step forward. Enough. Her voice cut clean, clear. You want to talk about what's deserved? He gave me comfort when you gave me calendar invites. He brought me dignity when you brought checklists. She pointed at the door. And if you can't see that, then maybe you were never really here either. Karen froze, lips trembling, eyes wide. But she didn't cry. She just turned and left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. The house settled into a terrible silence after that. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of aftermath. That evening, Mark sat alone in the backyard, watching twilight spill over the fence. Elaine came out slowly, wrapped in the same shawl, her cane tapping softly against the stones. She sat beside him, didn't speak for a while. Then quietly she said, I spent most of my life thinking blood made you family, but it doesn't. Not really. Showing up does, listening does, and you, Mark, you didn't just show up. You stayed, even when you had every reason not to. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, the boy who had once been a secret became something else entirely. Someone finally, irrevocably, seen. Elaine passed quietly on a Tuesday morning. The rain had softened overnight, tapping gently against the windows like it was asking for permission to grieve. Mark had been sleeping in the chair beside her bed, one hand resting lightly over hers, feeling the warmth leave minute by minute until it didn't anymore. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. The night before, she had whispered, "Thank you for staying." And in those 4 words, Mark found everything he had ever longed to hear. The house felt different after that. Still full, but quieter. Not empty, just settled. Karen didn't call. She didn't show up for the funeral, but the grandkids came, led by their father, who looked at Mark with a weary gratitude he couldn't quite voice. They brought flowers and shy glances, and one of them slipped a folded piece of paper into Mark's coat pocket before leaving. It was a crayon drawing of him and Elaine on the porch, under a sky full of stars, with the words, "She said you were the brave one, but peace doesn't come without a price." 2 weeks later, Mark received a notice. Karen was contesting the will, alleging undue influence, claiming her mother had not been of sound mind. That Mark, an unrelated caregiver with unclear intentions, had manipulated an old woman into rewriting her legacy. The accusations weren't new. The language wasn't surprising, but this time Mark didn't bend. He met with Elaine's lawyer, provided every message, every schedule, every photo of meals cooked and walks taken and blankets folded. But more than that, he provided presence. He had been there always. The judge dismissed the claim, firmly, unequivocally. Elaine Turner made her decisions clearly, repeatedly, and with full understanding, the ruling read. The presence of a non-blood relative in her estate is not grounds for suspicion, but a testament to where she found care. That sentence stayed with Mark longer than the paperwork. He didn't keep the house. He turned it into a nonprofit shelter for LGBTQ+ elders who had been pushed out by their families. A place where chosen family wasn't just a phrase, but a way of surviving. On the front steps, he planted a line of daisies, the kind ones. They bloomed for everyone. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, he'd sit on the same porch swing Elaine used to love, a blanket across his knees, a thermos of black coffee in hand. And when the wind was just right, he could almost hear her voice, not full of regret, but peace. He didn't need her to be perfect. She'd chosen him when it mattered. And that finally was enough. Have you ever had to redefine what family means for you? Tell us in the comments. Your story might be the one someone else needs today. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories. We share real, powerful stories of resilience, truth, and the quiet kind of love that never asks to be proven, only chosen.